Hello, my name is Dr. Moshe Appel, and I'm a clinical psychologist and I have a group practice called Psychology Center, where we specialize in anxiety, depression, and OCD. And I also post videos on these topics, so if you're interested, check out my website, adopsychology.com. Tonight's talk is on anxiety, all you need to know. So we're going to talk about a few different types of anxiety. I'm going to briefly mention some stories. We're going to talk about the common denominator amongst these anxieties, and what does therapy look like? How can you actually improve? So I want to begin by talking about David. David is constantly thinking that people are observing him. And when he goes into the gym, he's thinking how everyone is looking at him and wondering if he even knows what he's doing there. And when he goes on the bus, he's thinking that everyone is observing him and he doesn't want to act awkward or seem strange. And when he goes into the store and he has to ask a clerk where something is, he doesn't want to sound stupid because he cares so much about what people are thinking of him constantly. And this is a case of social anxiety disorder. In social anxiety, the core fear is a fear of negative evaluation. What are other people going to think of me? And this comes up a lot in classrooms and students. If you have to give a talk in front of a group of people, it comes up in social situations, it comes up at parties, it comes up all the time. And this is what social anxiety is all about. Now we're going to jump to panic disorder. Panic disorder is where it's also known as fear of fear. It's where someone is constantly scared of being scared, of having panic attacks. And a panic attack is where you have this abrupt surge of physiological symptoms that are very distressing. Increased heart rate, flight of thoughts, dizziness, maybe feeling faint, sweaty, nausea. And in panic disorder, someone has panic attacks and they're always worried about when the next one is coming as well. So they're having these random panic attacks, they're scared about when the next one's coming, and as you can imagine, this can be very debilitating because panic attacks are very uncomfortable. And the truth is, most of us experience multiple panic attacks throughout our lives at different points. But it becomes an issue when we're so concerned about the panic attacks. That's why it's called fear of fear. Next case I'm going to talk about is a very common one. It's where Rachel is very scared of vomit. And this case is a case of emetophobia. What I'm talking about more broadly is specific phobias in general. And a specific phobia is someone is so afraid of something that most people don't like, but they're not super afraid of it. So you could be very afraid of water. You could be very afraid of snakes. You could be very afraid of vomiting. You could be very afraid of heights, of planes. And so that's what specific phobias are all about. And again, it could be a very debilitating disorder. Next example we're going to talk about is Chana. Chana is constantly anxious about everything. In fact, she's always been anxious about everything her entire life. And she was known to be a worrywart, for example. So she's always worrying about whether she's going to get to her appointments on time. She's worried about what people are thinking of her. She's worried about whether her children are safe and okay. She's worried about everything under the sun. And not only that, but she has a lot of physiological symptoms that go along with it, like, feeling a pit in her stomach, or feeling tension in her muscles. And this is a case of generalized anxiety disorder. And generalized anxiety is what it sounds like. It's very generalized to all different matters. And many times we almost think of generalized anxiety disorder as a personality in a way, because people with generalized anxiety disorder typically feel this way for a very large part of life, and it's part of who they are. They're known as worriers, and they just can't get it out of their system. Last case I'm going to give you, actually, technically, according to the latest DSM, is not considered an anxiety disorder. It's its own category, but it used to be amongst the anxiety disorders, and it definitely shares a lot of similarities, and that's OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And obsessive-compulsive disorder, people are constantly concerned about all different obsessions, causing them a lot of distress. I've done a bunch of videos on different types of OCD, but in short, it's where someone's experiencing intrusive thoughts or urges or images that are very distressing, and then they're engaging in compulsions to get rid of that distress. A typical example might be washing your hands a lot because you're afraid you have germs on your hands. And other examples might be you're afraid that you might be a serial killer, and what if you are? And so you're so afraid to cut vegetables in the kitchen next to your kids because what if you were just to stab them? It could be all different types of scenarios that come up in OCD, but the gist of it is someone's experiencing these intrusive thoughts, engaging in these compulsions, and it's very, very, very uncomfortable. It's very distressing. And so what is the common denominator? I mentioned social anxiety, I mentioned panic disorder, I mentioned specific phobias, I mentioned generalized anxiety, I mentioned OCD, and each one has a different flavor. But the bottom line is the common denominator is that in all of these examples, you are experiencing a disproportionate fear response to a perceived threat. And if you're experiencing a disproportionate response to perceived threat, you're likely experiencing anxiety. So in social anxiety, the perceived threat is, if people think I'm stupid, that's really bad. What are people thinking of me? In panic disorder, the feared threat is that, I'm going to have a heart attack, or I hate these panic attacks, it feels terrible. In OCD, it might be whatever the OCD theme is. In specific phobias, I'm afraid the plane's going to crash. In generalized anxiety is, I'm afraid something happened to my kids, or why are they not home on time? And, what if I don't get to my appointment on time? There's always some kind of perceived threat. And anxiety response is when it's disproportionate. Now, I want to say that anxiety in general is actually a healthy emotion, and it's there to help us. And I see some questions in the chat, and we're going to get to those at the end, so stick around. But anxiety in general is there to help us. Imagine you weren't anxious about an upcoming test, then you wouldn't study for it, right? So anxiety is actually there to help us. It becomes a problem when it's either extreme or it's disproportionate to the facts. So if it's very intense and very distressing, or it's disproportionate to the facts, usually those are the times where it becomes more of an issue. So let's define what anxiety actually is. I mentioned how the common denominator between all these examples is that there's a perceived threat there's a disproportionate response to perceived threat, but anxiety in general can be defined as follows. Anxiety is a common emotion that is characterized by distressing thoughts and fears, physiological sensations, and behaviors of escape or avoidance. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because it's important to recognize that anxiety is not just an emotion or just a feeling in your body. It's accompanied with thoughts, behaviors, and physiological sensations. And the reason it's so important to recognize these three things is because treatment is really going to target these three areas, as I'll mention briefly soon. So before we get there, let's quickly differentiate between anxiety and stress, which are very similar but different. Sometimes people say, I'm so stressed out, and some people say, I'm so anxious. What's the difference? Stress is really very simply defined. It's defined as when your demands outweigh your resources. So if you have to get a lot done in a very short period of time, you feel stressed. Like, I don't know if I could do this. I feel so stressed out right now. Anxiety, on the other hand, like I mentioned before, is when there's some kind of threat hovering over you and you're afraid that you won't be able to handle it. Okay, so they're different. Stress is where you're stretched too thin, you have too many things to do, not enough time, or you have to spend money on tuition and your car and you're just running out of resources, you're running out of money, so that stresses you out. So stress and anxiety are a little bit different from each other. But when it comes to anxiety and someone's experiencing these really distressing thoughts, these physiological sensations that are uncomfortable, these behaviors of escape or avoidance, that's when we talk about therapy for anxiety. And the therapy that I specialize in is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a very straightforward way of doing the work. It's not getting into your childhood, it's not getting too deep, and sometimes we do have to. But for most people who are anxious, CBT is very, very helpful. And CBT really targets those three domains I mentioned before. It stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So the cognitive piece attacks the thoughts, the behavioral piece attacks the behaviors, and then the physiological piece, we also do physiological relaxation and other exercises to just decrease your physiological arousal. So let's get a little bit more specific. When it comes to the cognitive strategies from CBT for anxiety, you want to think about two different strategies. One strategy is changing the way you're thinking. If you're thinking in an irrational, disproportionate way, we want to help you restructure those thoughts so that you're thinking in a more accurate way. For example, if you're having the thought, I'm noticing my heart rate increasing, I'm so afraid of a panic attack, if I do, I'm going to die, we say, whoa, 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 whoa. You just had 100 panic attacks over the past year. You never once died, right? So you're not dying from panic attacks. Research shows you're not going to die from panic attacks. We're just restructuring those thoughts. And when you think differently about it, it's still uncomfortable, but it changes the overall experience of it. And over time, you're going to feel better and better. So that's just a quick example of cognitive restructuring. Let's say in social anxiety. Just restructuring thoughts and saying, like, when someone's at the gym, are you really observing them and looking at them and watching them? Do you really care what they're doing, or are you focused on yourself wearing your own earphones? And if that's the case, same thing for other people towards you. No one cares about what you're doing, what you're saying, or how you look. The other approach that's cognitive is called cognitive diffusion. That comes from ACT therapy. ACT stands for acceptance and commitment therapy. And in cognitive diffusion, you're not really changing the thoughts. Instead, you're distancing yourself from the thoughts. You're asking yourself one question, not whether the thought is true or not, like we would in CBT, but rather, is this thought helpful or not? And if the thought is not helpful, let me disengage from it. So for example, if you have the thought, people are looking at me funny, and therefore I don't want to go to the gym. Was that helpful in your life, or is that hurtful because you really should be going to the gym? If it's hurtful, you say, thank you for that thought, great thought, I don't care. I'm staying committed to my values. Now, I did a whole video on ACT therapy, so if this seems to not quite fit with you, you might want to watch the whole video so you can learn more about it. And you can find that on my website, adopsychology.com. But in short, that's what cognitive diffusion looks like. Let's jump now to behavioral strategies. As I mentioned before in anxiety, many times people are engaging in escape or avoidance. So we're avoiding the gym completely, or we're going, but the second we feel uncomfortable, we're running out of the gym. And so one type of behavioral approach to anxiety is called exposure therapy. It's where you slowly, not too quickly, don't get scared off, but you slowly attempt to engage in the behaviors that you're anxious about until your body becomes more and more used to that. Okay, so for example, in social anxiety, you would purposely go to the gym, you would purposely walk into a classroom maybe 2 minutes late, and you'll just sit through it. It's uncomfortable, but overall, it's going to be very, very effective. The behavioral approaches are very, very effective. Another behavioral approach is behavioral experiments, where you say, really, are you so sure that if you have a panic attack, you're gonna die? All right, let's experiment. You do it, you trigger a panic attack, and let's see if you die. You're not dying. Or if you're so concerned that if you come into class late, the teacher will yell at you and you won't be able to function, let's test it out. You do it once, you see it's not true. So behavioral experiments can also help with anxiety. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about today in terms of behavioral approaches is the idea, this works especially well for generalized anxiety disorder. Or for OCD, if someone's ruminating all day long and thinking all day long about their anxiety, about their OCD, then what they really need to do is segregate a time out during the day where you could think about your thoughts, about your anxious thoughts, but then you don't think about it the rest of the day. So you tell yourself 6 p.m., from 6 p.m. to 6:20 p.m., I'm going to think about all my anxious thoughts. Great. But the rest of the day, when your mind tries tricking you into start ruminating and thinking about some anxious thought, you say, I'm going to wait until 6 p.m. and that's when I'm going to think about it. So just isolating a time. Additionally, you don't want to isolate a time that's free rumination, which isn't so helpful. You want that time to be more problem-solving oriented, which means you sit down and you ask yourself, what's my goal here? What do I want to work on? How do I plan to get there? What am I anxious about? What can I do about it? You make it more tachlis oriented. You make it more problem-solving oriented versus just free rumination. So it's really two things. It's segregating a time out instead of thinking about it all day long. And it's also about doing it in a more productive way versus in just a ruminating way. And then, like I mentioned before, another piece of anxiety is those feelings in your body that are very uncomfortable. And for that, you can do any kind of relaxation skill that you find helpful. You could do deep breathing, you could do progressive muscle relaxation, you can do some mindfulness, you can take a hot shower, you can listen to music. There are tons of strategies online, and therapists are always talking about coping strategies. Any one that works for you is fine. But that's just about physiologically calming your body down. The real treatment, though, is the changing your thoughts, perspective, and changing the behaviors and doing exposures. So in short, just to summarize, we spoke about the different types of anxiety. We spoke about such as social anxiety and generalized anxiety and specific phobias and panic disorder. We even mentioned OCD, which is very related. We defined what anxiety is, which is this disproportionate fear to perceived threat, and we mentioned how included in that is thoughts, is feelings, emotions, is behaviors. We differentiated anxiety from stress, and how stress is just where you have too much on your plate, and anxiety is where you're nervous, you're worried that you won't be able to deal with some kind of threat that's coming your way. And then we discussed some strategies, including cognitive, behavioral, and physiological. So I'm going to now look at some questions in the chat and see if I can respond to them. But if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me through my website, which is adopsychology.com. And you can also watch my other videos there on other topics as well. So you can post more questions in the chat now if you'd like, but I noticed one a little bit earlier, which I'll get to right now. And the question is, what about when you have the physiological sensations jumping out of your skin, but without anxious thoughts? Is that anxiety? It's a great question. And the answer might depend on who you ask, but I guess you're asking me, so I'll give you my answer. I would say a few things. Usually, anxiety is associated with thoughts. Now, many times people have trouble identifying what thoughts actually am I thinking that are causing me to be anxious. So just because you're not readily able to identify the thoughts doesn't mean that they're not there. So that's step one, really trying to figure out, are there any thoughts there that maybe you're not recognizing, but really that they're still there? And one of the ways you might do that is you might ask yourself, what was going on in my life during that time when I started feeling this anxiety? And that can give you a hint as to maybe what you were thinking then as well. However, yes, sometimes it's a more deep core feeling. It might even be related to some kind of traumatic response. Feeling distressing, intense physiological sensations doesn't necessarily mean it's anxiety. It could be related to trauma or to something else. So it could be anxiety, and it's not related to concrete thoughts that you have in your mind, and it's more deeper type of thoughts or reactions to a certain situation. For those of you who've studied psychology, classical conditioning can explain why certain situations just trigger this anxious response, even if you don't have a very specific thought in mind. So it could be anxiety, but it's not necessarily anxiety. It could be something else as well. And even if it is anxiety and you don't have thoughts, it could be there are thoughts there, just hard to identify. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you all for joining, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Have a good night.